So I'm Ken Cerini. I'm managing partner of Cerini Associates. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I'm going to kind of serve as a moderator of today. It doesn't mean that I won't answer questions and chime in because I have a large mouth and never let that stop me before. And I do this because at home, my wife talks a lot, so I never get a word in edgewise there, so I have to kind of get it everywhere else I can. We were sitting together. We had Jim, Ed, and Dave were sitting around one day, and we said, you know, there's just so much stuff happening in the nonprofit sector, and there's so much regulations and information that the sector needs. And we said, you know, there has to be a way that we can push some of that information out to the sector. So we decided that we'd jointly put together a panel discussion. I prepared some questions, but really this is an opportunity for you guys to ask a bunch of questions and kind of learn from the experts. The bios are around, but Jim is a property management specialist. Ed is in benefits and can answer any questions regarding staffing issues that might come around. And David just basically knows absolutely everything. So you can ask David anything you want and he can answer the question. So we're going to get started. If anybody has questions, just raise your hand, chime in. We want to make this as interactive as possible. This is really all about you, and this is for your benefit. So any questions that you have, just kind of jump in and ask. But I want to first start off by just asking the panelists if they can each spend about a minute or two talking about who they are, how they work with the sector, and what are some of the things they're seeing within the sector. So Jim, we'll start with you. There's a microphone right here. Sure. You're welcome. Oh, you know what? Well, you need it for the presentation, so we have to have it. It's on.
Okay, well, welcome, first of all. Good morning. My name is Jim Sheuchenko. I am a partner in the firm Property Management Advisors. I've been in the real estate industry for 38 years. 24 of those years was spent with Kimco Realty as their director of property management. And at that time, we had over 1,900 properties and probably somewhere in the vicinity of 170 million square feet of shopping centers across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I retired in 2012, but I retired for 3 days. And then I started Property Management Advisors. I have 3 other partners, 2 of whom are here today. We do property management. And property management is a big encompassing word. But what we do, we've kind of been attracted to or they've attracted to us because of the sense of what we do. And that is the physical asset management of the properties. Because what generates along the operating income here, or I should say expenditures, your operating budgets, is what Ken comes up to and says, hey, you spent $30,000 on roofing, you did this, you did that. Well, we try to look at that and say, what can we do to plan those expenditures so you don't run into situations where I need $100,000, I need $200,000 for paving, I need this, I need that. How do we put you on a fiscal diet and planning to get you right on track? Ken, I think I covered all those questions, right?
Thanks. Ed?
Good morning, everybody. And first, I just want to start by thanking Ken, Lula, and Christine for their effort today. This is a fantastic event, a great room. I think this room is beautiful. I do feel a little bit like I'm in Congress right now, so easy on the questions. My name is Ed Probst. I'm the founding partner of the Vanguard Agency. We've been an employee benefits consulting firm for almost 20 years now, 19 years this August. I am a registered health underwriter, a chartered healthcare consultant. I have a certification in healthcare reform studies. So this is my sweet spot. This is what I love to do and advise on nonprofits, on staffing and employee benefits, and really just how to become an employer of choice when it comes to recruiting their top talent. Some of the things we do is we're group benefit advisors. So we work on benefit plans and health insurance strategies and ancillary and voluntary benefits. We're PEO consultants, so we help organizations talk about PEO and see if they're right for a PEO, and if they are, we help them navigate through those minefields. And we do a complete diagnostic for our clients that helps them analyze, the best places they should be, whether it be in a PEO world or it's direct in the health insurance and direct benefit market. What makes us unique is our focus on education. It's in our tagline. We talk about educating employers one employee at a time, and we really believe in that deeply, that educating employers through compliance strategies and the complexity of navigating through health insurance and benefits, but more importantly, getting involved very detailed with each and every employee of an organization, because we feel like educated employees make educated choices on their benefits, which drives down costs long term.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Ken and his team for putting this together. I'm glad you're all here. Welcome. David Goldstein. I'm a lawyer at Certilman Balin. We have 2 offices in East Meadow and Hauppauge, about 90 lawyers and 15 different practice groups. And that's actually really important, and that's one of the reasons why I am at Certilman Balin, because those various practice groups are essential to me being able to serve my nonprofit clients and help them with the different aspects of law that they have to deal with. And to that point, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later maybe, but in one of the materials that you've got is a little pamphlet on some of the new sexual harassment compliance requirements. And that's an area where our employment law department works with my clients to help them comply with some of these new requirements, some of which went into effect just 2 days ago on October 9th. Probably what's, I think, unique about my approach to nonprofits is, I think, is what my frame of reference is not originally as a lawyer for nonprofits. My introduction to the nonprofit sector was, in fact, as a board member. I was asked to serve on a nonprofit board and started asking questions, and no one had the answers, not the senior staff, not the chairman of the board, and interestingly, not the outside counsel for the nonprofit. And that sort of has guided me in my approach to representing nonprofits. I try to continue to have that frame of reference that I had as a board member, and answer those questions. So how do you protect the organization? How do you help the organization understand what its responsibilities and compliance obligations are? And how do you protect the individual directors and officers in terms of potential breaches of duty and personal liability? And that is fundamental to my approach. When someone serves a nonprofit as a director or an officer, in my mind, it's absolutely unacceptable for them to wind up with any kind of personal liability, and we do our best to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, David, since you have the microphone, we'll ask the first question to you. So what do you see as some of the top challenges, complaints that you've heard from the nonprofit sector, and how have you helped them resolve some of those?
Well, probably the greatest challenge, and this is a complaint I hear all the time, and it's completely understandable, is as a nonprofit, how can I possibly keep up? And you know, the sexual harassment regs that just come into play are a great example. How can I possibly keep up with layer upon layer, ever expanding compliance requirements and regulations? That's, I think, the greatest challenge and the greatest complaint. And the bottom line is, you can't do it by yourself. There are federal regulations that are applicable to you, state regulations, local regulations, and sometimes there are multiple layers of regulations on the same issue. So, for instance, sexual harassment. New York State has requirements that came online 2 days ago. New York City also has requirements on sexual harassment, and there are federal regulations as well. So, and of course, what makes it even more challenging is that even though there are 3 layers of regulations, they're all different. So it's New York State, for instance, requires every nonprofit, every employer to adopt a sexual harassment policy. New York City, if you operate in the city, also requires a sexual harassment policy. But guess what? The policies are different, so you can't adopt one policy and satisfy both. So that's an example of the layers and the complexity. And Bottom line is that no nonprofit can do it on their own. The time of being able to rely on volunteers serving on your board who might be lawyers or accountants or insurance professionals, that day has passed because the level of expertise that's required is greater than what the typical board person and volunteer can provide. So I would say probably about 80% of my practice is cleaning up what has gotten bollocksed up over time by well-meaning people trying to help, but without that required level of expertise. So
David, I was going to say, can you give? You and I worked on a case together where there was an organization that didn't quite modify their governing document correctly. You want to just kind of throw out that example and kind of explain that?
Sure. This is actually a very common problem, and if you've heard me speak before, you may have heard me allude to it. Your basic governing document is a certificate of incorporation. Every nonprofit has that document. It's the first document that you file. And the key provision in there is your corporate purposes, and everything you do emanates from those purposes, and you're not permitted to use any of your assets outside of those purposes. And what very often happens over time is a good nonprofit it evolves its mission and its services over time. But the trick is you need to, before you do that, or as you do that, you need to amend your corporate purposes, and it can be a source of great liability and headaches, to say the least, when you don't adjust your purposes to keep up with the changes in your mission. So that's one example. There are lots of balls in the air that you have to keep your eye on at all times. And one of the other things that you have in your materials is an article that I wrote last year called Governance, It's Not Rocket Science. And that's kind of my mantra, and I'll come back to that probably before we're done today. And it isn't rocket science. Nothing that I deal with is incredibly complicated. But what it does take is consistent focus and discipline. And that's the only way that nonprofits can keep up with the challenges of ever-expanding regulations and compliance requirements, is to have that focus and discipline and commitment and put the effort in to manage that.
Yeah, I was going to say what makes it even tougher in the nonprofit sector is nonprofits, by their very nature, dealing with governmental agencies, have to deal with compliance. I mean, they're compliance-based organizations. So you talk about, one of the biggest things is all these compliance-related issues, and the compliance-related issues are in just about absolutely everything the nonprofit sector does. So Ed, you want to answer the same question?
Yeah, so I would say the top thing that we hear is just overall sustainability, and how organizations keep up with the challenges of decreased government funding and increased expenses and keeping their head above water. The number one thing that relates to our industry is health insurance. And it is a challenge. I think everybody in here has been affected by it in some way or another. Costs have increased dramatically over the years and are still increasing. And how do you keep up with that and still become an employer of choice when you're attracting and recruiting employees? The nonprofit sector, particularly, is a sector that gives strong benefits to their employees and have high contributions. That being said, salary is probably the reason why it's hard for nonprofits to keep up with for-profit businesses in recruiting and retention from a salary standpoint. So benefits have to be at the top of the list and high quality and high contributions. So that being said, how do you keep up with that, be able to attract those employees, retain them, and stay within your budget? I think that health insurance is probably the number one or number two cost for most nonprofits that are hiring employees. So it is something that is particularly challenging. And I think you need to be strategic and you need to think out of the box a little bit. One thing that we see in that realm is that a lot of plans are kind of on autopilot per se. nonprofits have, and they're varying in size and scope, but nonprofits may have had plans that they feel that they have to keep because they don't want to pass contributions onto their employees, they don't want to raise deductibles, they don't want to raise co-insurance, and they've kind of given up on how they can go about saving money and keeping that employer of choice model. So I think you need to think out of the box a little bit. I think administration of the plan might become a little bit more complex in some degrees, but if we're looking at saving costs to the organization, which can be just as important in some cases as fundraising, reducing costs could be just as impactful to the organization. We have to think out of the box a little bit. And some of the things that we've done over the years to that point is work with PEOs, and that really is something that could affect smaller organizations to larger organizations, but more impactful in that, let's call it 2 to 150 market as far as size of employees. We've created strategies where we've been able to pass on really reduce savings to the employees in cost to the employee contributions and to the organization by pooling businesses and organizations together to provide outsourced technology and benefits and HR and things like that. Private exchange is something that we've been really impactful with in helping organizations create contribution strategies that by allowing choice for their employees. And I think that's a big thing. Education, choice, and contribution strategies can really help an organization drive down costs. An impactful contribution strategy can help employees pick plans that really are catered and geared towards their needs. And when that happens, the overall cost of the plans go down. So I think that is really impactful. And a voluntary benefit plan. We had an organization just recently that was facing a 35% increase on their benefit costs, and their best offer was a 19% increase. So when we look at cases like that, we don't look at how do we reduce the increase, we look at how do we drive down costs from the year before. What we were able to do is think out of the box a little bit and implement a strategy where they were actually able to pass on a bronze level type plan to their employees without any disruption from the prior year, using health reimbursement strategies, arrangement strategies, as well as voluntary benefits. And by doing so, we just passed our first year, and the overall savings over the year before was about $388,000 to the organization. So things like that, I think the key there is you really need to think out of the box, and there is a way. You just have to really, really dive deep and get in the weeds a little bit to find it.
Jim, from a property management perspective?
I'm going to put our boots on the ground now. Property management advisors, I'll just use the acronym PMA from here on to make it simple. What these gentlemen are talking about is creating value for you. That is what we do here, but we do it on an operational level because there are things that occur in your operating budgets, in your capital and major repairs, that what we've seen generally is not a strong point with a lot of the companies. Now, I don't know how many engineers we have here or people who have construction backgrounds. You know, David alluded to being a board member, asking questions. Ed just spoke to you about saving money, looking and combing through these benefits and things like that. And we're now looking at a more physical thing, looking at the building, looking at your operating budgets. Where are you spending money? Where are you, in some terms, really losing the money that could be used for other things, helping those people who you are entrusted to helping. So when we look at taking care of like major repairs, capital repairs, how do we stage some of these things so you don't say, you know what, you go to the board and you say, well, we need a new roof or we need a new parking lot. And they say, well, how much is it going to cost? Let's just say $100,000. In some cases, it could be $200,000 or $300,000, depending upon the type of roof, the building, and things like that. So oftentimes we've seen like these people do not know anything about this. They're concerned about the bottom line. But if I'm on the board, I'm asking, well, what were we doing for previous years to extend the life of that roof or that parking lot? How can we stage this so instead of spending $300,000 this year, maybe we can do 100, 100, 100. So that, just picture this if your taxes, I'm in dangerous territory here with Nassau County, but if your taxes each year went, it was up here, then down here a little bit, then it really went up here, you don't want that. You want your budget to be just kind of like, you know what you're going to spend. Maybe not, you don't like that bottom line, but the issue is, what we try to do is look at all those line items, comb through them and say, why are you paying PSE&G so much money? Well, because your air conditioning is working very inefficiently. And PSE&G waits out on the pole on a nice hot July day. And when you hit that top peak electric, that's what you get priced for electric for the rest of the year. Now, if we can look at that and we can lower that demand, you're in the money. If we can bring you energy efficiency, and today it's a lot easier, it doesn't have to be hardwired, it can be wireless technology. If you're looking at changing air conditioning units, things like that, you can have a strong reduction in demand. What do you do with that money? You can do whatever you like with it and put it wherever you like. But again, I think for us, what we see with boots on the ground is the capital major repairs and how can we bring you energy efficiency? It's becoming cheaper. With all the intelligence that's out there right now, we can control various units. And I don't want to get into the details of that, but you can get a tremendous reduction in your demand and lowering of costs. We all, three of us, create value.
Yeah, when you talk about lowering costs, one of the things that we're seeing out there in the marketplace right now is government funders just don't want to pay for administrative costs. So again, if you can find ways to lower your costs and bring that down, that helps. Also, anybody who gets a lot of money from New York State is fully aware of EO 38, Executive Order 38, which limits your administrative spending to 15%. So anytime you can kind of control some of those administrative costs, that's going to be helpful. Some of the other things that we're seeing out there is with the new tax laws that are going into effect, there's talk that the amount of contributions is going to be down this year. So if the amount of contributions are going to be down and everybody's competing for the same dollars, how do you get your message out there, right? How do you rise above what everybody else is saying so that your organization stands out? Especially when you're in a marketplace where the world has gotten a whole lot smaller and people are giving dollars to wherever the latest, big incident happened. So if, Florida gets hit with a hurricane, that's where the dollars run because obviously they're needed there, but that is at the impact of the local nonprofit organizations. People don't necessarily give locally anymore, they kind of give globally. So again, how do you get your message out there? What are you guys doing from a social media perspective to kind of get your voice heard and to ensure that everybody understands what it is your organization does, what separates you from everybody else and what your overall impact is. And these are things that are going to be very important for you in terms of messaging. Anybody have any questions before I kind of move on to the next? Okay.
The risk that you were speaking about in regards to corporation what is the risk?
So the question was, what is the risk, only because we're on a webinar. So the question was, what is the risk that comes into play if an organization does not or expands beyond its original certificate of incorporation? What's the quote unquote penalty?
It's a good question. Thank you for asking it because it amplifies the issue. So it ties back to a few different things, including personal liability of directors and officers, because one of the fundamental duties, and directors and officers under the law in New York have legal duties, fiduciary duties, and one of the fundamental duties is the duty of obedience. You've got actually a publication from the Attorney General's Charities Bureau in your materials called Right from the Start, the responsibilities of directors of nonprofit organizations, and that'll give you some it's actually wonderful publication that'll give you some information on that. But so as a director or an officer, both, your responsibility is to obey your corporate documents and your purposes. You are essentially the guardian of the assets of the organization. And if, in fact, even the legal principle is that even if your assets are used for an incredibly worthy purpose, if that purpose is not consistent with your corporate purposes, then each director and officer has personal liability for that. So that's one level, the personal liability. Remember where I started, that my orientation as coming into this, not as a lawyer originally, but as a board member, is board members and officers should never get slammed with personal liability for putting themselves out there and trying to serve a nonprofit and serve people in need. So that's one aspect. And then the other piece and I think you alluded to it in your question, can you lose your nonprofit status? When you apply to the IRS for tax exemption, your exemption is granted based on certain activities that you're telling the IRS you're going to engage in. Those activities are what's in your certificate of incorporation, amplified by your application to the IRS. And so when you go beyond that, those activities possibly could be outside of your exemption, and you can lose your exemption. I appreciate the question, because hopefully you can see that, and thank you, Ken, for introducing that subject, because it's very simple. The concept is simple, but the ramifications are incredibly far-reaching for the organization and the directors, and so that's something you always have to keep your eye on.
Hello, thank you. So along the same lines, but a little off to the side, is that our auditors have required us, and required in quotes, us to have our board members have a board member agreement. Where do you stand on that? It's not legal according to the IRS. However, it is something that our auditors have recommended highly, and wondering if anybody else here as a not-for-profit has that requirement of their board members. It's been a bone of contention at board meetings. However, we did take it on as a requirement of our board members. Wondering what the take is on that.
I'll jump in first. We recommend to clients that they should think about having a board contract. It's not, as far as I know, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, it's not a legal requirement to have one. The reason we recommend a board contract, I find that if you sit with a board member and you discuss what their responsibilities are, board members have good intentions, but life gets in the way. If you put it in writing, you typically find, and the board member signs it, board members tend to take that a little more seriously. So I think it's effective in the fact that you have board members who will take it a little more seriously. Also, it makes it easier to remove a board member if the board member is not following what the contract calls for. Because in your bylaws, you'll lay out what the organization requires of their board members. But it's easier when it's put in a contract, because then you can point to a contract and say, you really didn't fulfill your obligation under the contract. They can agree to it, and then you can kind of get someone off a board a little bit easier. So I personally like board contracts. I think board contracts should be two-way streets, where there's something that the board member is saying that they will do for the organization, but there are things that the organization should say they will do for the board too, such as ensuring that there's officers, directors and officers insurance, possibly providing an indemnity clause within the agreement, ensuring that the board is going to receive timely information so the board can make intelligent decisions, those types of things. So I personally like them, but as far as I know, they're not required. David, anybody else?
Yeah, that's right. They're not legally required, and but it certainly is an expanding trend to one way or another.
Well, that's because I've been telling everybody to do it.
That's right. Why. There you go. Your reach is impressive. And there are different ways you can approach it. Probably the clearest and most direct way is, as you're saying, a written agreement that's signed. Perhaps a softer way, and some organizations prefer the softer approach, and that they always have open to them, going to a more direct approach down the road, is just a document that's perhaps included in a board manual that lays out those expectations and doesn't quite require it doesn't say, okay, you've got to sign and say that you're agreeing to it, but there it is in your board manual, and it's clearly set out as the expectations of every board member. So that's a softer approach that culturally some nonprofits prefer, but that certainly is something, and I think it's coming about. This trend in this direction is really coming about because of the clash between people's desire to be on boards. Kind of as Ken said, life gets in the way. you step forward, you volunteer, and on one level, you should really know as a board member what's expected of you. It shouldn't come as a surprise 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, that there were expectations that you didn't live up to. So it's kind of a rational approach to a very practical problem.
Yeah, I've also find that when you have a give or get responsibility, by putting that give or get in the contract, again, it gets taken much more seriously. I've seen organizations, once they put that agreement in place with the give or get, their give or get percentage goes up. So let's say, before they had the agreement, maybe 40% of their board or 50% of their board was giving, and once they put the agreement in place, it's closer to 70 or 80%. So that give or get definitely gets more firmly entrenched within an agreement. Frank?
Can I just elaborate?
Go ahead.
Question on that? Like, what happens if you don't have a 100% buy-in from your board, if it's not a legal requirement?
So what happens if you don't have 100% buy-in from your board if it's not a legal requirement? That's going to be at a organization by organization perspective. You have to decide that is this something that's important. But the thing is, if it's not important enough to get everybody to sign it, then it's probably not something you should be doing. Because if you're not going to hold all board members to the same standard, you probably don't want to implement it. And if you're getting pushback from your board, you might want to take the softer approach that David mentioned.
And this is on a webinar, right? That we can show at the board meeting?
Yes, it's on the webinar.
Thank you.
So I'm board chair at Holy Cross High School in Bayside, and attending a seminar with Ken I guess last year, when this first came up about a board agreement, a contract. I said, this is a great idea for our board. And as sitting in board meetings, I saw that there were some active board members and some inactive. So I said, okay, this is going to be an initiative for 2018 to have a board contract. But what I called it was a board agreement, not a contract. And that, to David's point, it was still an agreement that I asked people to sign, but it didn't sound so onerous when I called it an agreement as opposed to a contract. Everybody signed it, except for an attorney, interestingly enough, who said, why do we need an agreement? Why do we need a contract?
Damn attorneys.
Yeah. Most people signed it without even questioning it, but I wrote it with the president of the organization of our school. And as Ken said, it's a give and take. This is what we expect of the board. This is what we can expect from the school, and this is what the school should expect from the board. So we each had setting our expectations out. And even though it was in the board, in the bylaws, as Ken said, putting it in a separate document, which we asked people to sign, gave it a little more impact. And it's been a positive thing so far. As soon as I get this one attorney to come to the right side of the fence. But it's been effective for us, and I'm glad that I learned from it.
Question over there next.
So we've been using contracts for quite a while, but we have a very small board, very small nonprofit. And so I think a lot of situations that apply to many, like a school board, is a little different. A lot of our members, we don't have a large board. They feel they're volunteering. And so when you start to put certain restrictions on them or make certain demands, you get that kind of response. Well, I'm volunteering. This is not, mandatory. I'm doing this because, out of the kindness of my heart. So you get a little kickback on some things. But I want to say to the young lady that was addressing whether something's legal or not, we get government funding. And oftentimes the response we get is, well, no, it's not a legal requirement, but we're funding you and it's a funding requirement. And so, there is that also perspective. And when we bring it to the board that way, well, we have to do this because, the funder is requiring it, but it's not necessarily illegal.
Are there funders that have required agreements? Because I actually haven't.
Not a contract. I'm talking about,
okay.
Just
yes.
in general. That was a gen. I do move like that.
That's okay.
So I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But yeah, I was kind of finished with that contract issue. But to move to the other issue of whether something's legal or required or not.
Right.
there are funders who will require things of you that are not legal, but they are requiring them as part of your funding. And that's all I want to say.
Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Bill McAndrews. I'm with National Executive Service Corps. We're a nonprofit consulting firm, and we work with a number of boards and organizations. And when we work with organizations, we always ask the question, how effective is the board? We have found that virtually every effective board has some written agreement. It may not be a contract, but it clearly states roles, responsibilities, give or get, whatever that is, and even in smaller organizations, so everybody knows where they're going, what they're doing. From a foundation standpoint, you're trying to demonstrate you're the people that should get the funding. You can demonstrate, look, we have an agreement. Our board is effective and it worked. So from our perspective, we would say get some sort of agreement. Everybody understands roles and responsibilities. It might not be a legal contract, but as you were rightfully pointing out, I think, thoughtfully pointing out, everybody knows where they're going. And you can demonstrate to the external people, you can extern to your internal organization. And we have found that when we work with an organization, you said, look, you should put some sort of written statement, agreement, whatever you want to call it, with your board. And if people don't want to, smaller and larger organizations don't want to understand what the benefit is, well, then maybe you need to change the board. I mean, that happens. Thank you.
There's another question back there. I like this interactive group. This is good.
Just one more point on the same topic. Boards should evaluate their overall performance at the end of the year and individual board member performance. So by having the kind of agreement we're talking about, it gives them something to measure performance against.
Thanks. And down on the phone.
I'd like to go back to another topic. Legislation, tax rules. Is there anyone representing nonprofits as a lobbyist or to give input on legislation before it becomes legislation, or input on tax laws before they pass these laws, so that the legislators can be educated to get things right? Do we have representation? Is there such a group?
So I can take part of that. And I should have mentioned earlier, so it's a good reminder for me. One of the things I do is I'm the chairman of the New York State Bar Association Committee on Nonprofit Corporations. And as part of, in that role, we liaise with the legislature and with the Attorney General with respect to proposed changes to the law. And there are lots of other organizations at lots of other levels. Again, federal, state, local. There are umbrella organizations for nonprofits that do that kind of liaising and maybe even lobbying. It's interesting that it's a challenge, right? I mean, because there are lots of things driving, and I know this from my own experience, driving legislators besides what maybe makes sense on the ground from the people who are kind of knee deep in it. So sometimes we're consulted and we give our input, and sometimes we find out that there's a proposal that's been moved out of committee in the legislature, and it's going to be considered by the legislature, and nobody even asked us about it, and we have to run in at the last minute and explain why we think it's a problem. So it's not the most efficient process from what I've seen, but there is a process at the at the various levels.
Yeah, and there's so many trade organizations that rifle through, whether it be tax law, whether it be new reimbursement methodology or anything like that. They go through this stuff and they really advocate for the sector that they represent. So, go ahead.
So my question, it came up earlier about give-gets, and I'm interested to see really, when I meet with organizations, I find not everybody has those sort of policies in place. So I thought maybe from Ken and David's perspective, and obviously the other guys as well, or even anybody out here could talk about the value of a give-get and just kind of expand.
Let's just ask the question, how many of you require from your boards a give or get? So we're looking at maybe about half. So about half of you require your board to either give money or get money from someone they know. I think it's a fundamental responsibility of the board of directors to help fund the organization that they work with. And I think it's also important to be able to, especially an organization that goes after contributions, it's also important to be able to say that 100% of your board gives. And not everybody has the ability to give the same amount of money. So some organizations have a set dollar amount give or get, and some organizations just have a requirement to give or get something during the course of the year. That's going to be up to the organization. But I think if you're going out there into the world and you're asking for contributions and you can't say that your board effectively gives to the organization, what message is that sending out to everybody else? So I think it's fundamentally important to have a give-get.
And that was a really good point in terms of their various levels of how you're going to come at that give-get. And I'm working with one board now where they're going to eventually wind up with a number in their written expectations. But right now there's nothing, and so they're starting sort of with a tiered approach. And what's going to be in, as Ken enunciated it, what's going into their expectations now is an expectation that every board member gives something, so that the organization can say that there's 100% participation, which is really important to lots of funders to see that. And so that's a soft approach, and a couple of years from now, that bar is going to get raised. But it's a strategic approach to dealing with this issue over a period of years, and so that's a lot of organizations take it that way. That sort of stepwise strategy.
I was going to make the same point. We started on your recommendation with a give or get, and now it's a give and get. So there is a minimum requirement of a board member to give so much, and there is also you have to get so much. Those are minimum requirements. So it's a give and get, and to your point. Okay. Ed, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on that because I do serve on boards, and one thing that I've noticed is it is challenging for nonprofits to recruit board members, and sometimes that interview process in the beginning might not be so rigorous because you need board members. And my philosophy has always been in boards, and we've been asked to join other boards and have turned them down. And my philosophy on it is basically that when I go in, I want to give my all to that board from a give-get perspective, but also my time and my knowledge to the board. And I think that everybody's different. Every board is different. Every board member is different. There might be people that join boards because it's great to be on a board, and maybe they're in many boards. And maybe that's an important thing to know as a nonprofit is to you board members, how many boards are they actually on? Because how much can you possibly give? And I know that from the boards that I serve on, that I'm all in with those boards. And I know it's impossible for me to be all in on more than those that I serve on right now. So maybe I'm giving a unique perspective from a board member, but also from a nonprofit and seeing what our nonprofit clients convey to us and the challenges they have recruiting board members. Maybe it's just more of a rigorous process aside from the contract and the give-get, but interviewing that board member to know what they're all about, what their motivation is, and what their intentions are.
We do personal best, so it's like whatever you can give. But we're so heavily reliant upon, government funding. And in Nassau County, it has been so...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. What?
No,
what
that you're dealing with Nassau County. Yeah.
Well, that's the problem. So, it has its, drawbacks. Yes, thank you. So, the problem I'm having, and I don't know that you could help with this, so, and it may be something we should talk about after or something, but is that because of the funding process in Nassau County, they're either terminating our contract, holding our contract, holding up funding. The board has become somewhat just very lackadaisical about everything. It's been a very personal, devastating and traumatic impact in terms of how they're treating our contracts. And I'm not sure, as the administrator or the executive director, how to really address that with them.
Well, I think that's where board education comes into play. Having board understand the information of what's happening truly within the organization, providing the board with analysis so the board can really see how much reserves you have, what you need. It comes back to what Jim talked about before. If you have, property, how do you manage that property more effectively so that you're not getting hit with a big cost all at once? So how do you put all those pieces together so that the board has good information and the board can really understand what's happening within your organization? And the other thing is political pressure. You got to find some politicians that are willing to put some political pressure where it's needed.
Well, that's what worked. I mean, we did finally get our contract and we got everything moving, but we really do have to get past the point of being so heavily dependent.
Right, and that's where the board responsibility to raise funds comes in, so that you can generate cash reserves and hold those cash reserves so that you've got 30 days of operations or 60 days of operations or 90 days of operations. Yes. I see you looking at me.
Hi, I have a question about the get. You're all talking about give. What exactly is appropriate for them to get when we're talking about the board receiving something from the organization?
Receiving what? No. Give, get is, it's the other way. Give, get is either, if I'm a board member, I either give money to the organization out of my pocket, or I get people I know to donate to the organization.
Okay.
Getting from the organization, I'm not sure that there's anything that's overly appropriate there.
Agreed. But does the organization, when board members come, we have board members who come from all over the country. They're not all in New York. So they're paid for their travel to come to the organization, to a board meeting, their stay. Is that an appropriate use of the funds?
That's a very common practice for organizations that are national in scope. But Ken mentioned something earlier, I think, that ties into something that you're asking about as well, which is that it really is a two-way street. And that's critical, I find, in working with boards all the time. Board members need to be respected. They need to be resourced. So there needs to be, as Ken mentioned, there needs to be board education. You can't just be thrown in. There needs to be mentoring of new board members. There needs to be a board manual with materials. They've got to get documents. They've got to get expectations, both legal expectations and the kind of board member expectations that we were talking about. And that two-way street is critical. And it goes as far as, I was at a board meeting about a week ago in a large conference room, and there were about 15, 20 people in the conference room, and maybe another half a dozen people on the phone. Big conference room though, and one speakerphone. And so when anybody at the far end of the room said anything, somebody on the phone said, "Oh, I couldn't hear that. Could somebody repeat it?" And little things like that. I mean, that's easy. That, again, not rocket science, right? But things like that really contribute to board culture and efficiency and respect, and having respect for some of the nonprofit boards that I work with that are most effective. Really focus on getting documents out to board members in a user-friendly format, getting it out to them way in advance of meetings, and also being respectful of their time. I know one board chair who probably during every meeting says at least twice, "We're going to be respectful of your time." And that goes to managing personalities on your board. Sometimes you've got an outsized personality who likes to hear himself talk or herself talk, and that's not fair to the other board members who've got better things to do with their time, and that has to be managed as well. So the two-way street piece of it is really important. And when you're managing your board and a nonprofit, it's kind of hard to stay focused on that. But I'm glad Ken mentioned that two-way street is something to always keep in mind.
By the way, I think this is your third question, so this is it.
All right, I'm done after this.
We don't want you monopolizing the. Yeah.
Who leaked the documents? Was it Dianne Feinstein? No. Just it's another observation. This will be my last one. There's been a dramatic growth in the number of nonprofits in the last 15 years. It's now about 1 point, depending on what you look at, but the IRS says it's about 1.1 501c3 nonprofits. It doesn't take a lot to create a nonprofit, and we're in an entrepreneurial age and people want to start their own. But to your point about board education, there's a huge gap between what it takes to start a nonprofit, which is not terribly difficult. It can be time consuming because there's delay, but it's not difficult. And what it takes to have good governance, a huge gap. And the result is that we have a lot of the problems that we experience today because people don't understand that there's a great responsibility when it comes to governance. They think all they have to do is get a bunch of people in a room, get my certificate of incorporation, get my 501c3, register to raise money, and I'm off and running. And they don't pay any attention to what is involved in actually governing an organization.
I think you're going to see a certain level of consolidation take place in the sector. There has to be, especially with government-funded organizations, because we're just in a situation where there's only so much money going around. If we do get Medicaid block grants that the federal government is talking about, that could actually diminish the amount of federal funding and state funding that comes into play. So you'll probably see some level of consolidation in the under managed care. So we'll see.
Yeah, go ahead. Richard, I just wanted to respond to your question or your statements here. What we find, again, on a physical level, is that when we go to boards and we try to, we try to educate them about the physical plant or, HVAC. I mean, there's a really deep gap. And we try to make that as simple as possible, showing, and what we can do is give them the data to take a look at, here's the bottom line, and here's why this makes sense for you. But we find that a lot of the people just don't have that background. Some do. I'm not saying everybody, I don't make a generalization here, but that's our education. And I think what the point is, how do you educate some of these people? You can put the group together, you can get the board together. Are they educated in all facets of the business?
Let's stay on that topic one second. Let me just ask a follow-up question. So you're in a situation, one of the things that I find is that the board tends to talk about just those things that are brought to the board by the executive director. What sort of information should executive director or CEO of an organization be bringing to their boards of directors from a property management perspective, from a Department of Labor or benefits perspective, and from a legal perspective, so that that these things are being discussed on a regular basis at board meetings? Because I think board meetings tend to fall into patterns, and you don't necessarily get to cover all of the things that the board really should be aware of. So we'll start with you, Jim.
Wear out shoe leather. Andrea Riga is sitting right here. And I'm going to tell you, she walked with us. She went through the property, and her and Jan Friedman said, let's take a look. Let me show you. Let me speak to you about what we're looking to do and where we're going to spend your money. What's going to happen here? I mean, she had a really good handle on the projects we were doing, which is, number one, a major parking lot asphalt overlay. We did ADA compliance issues. We're doing HVAC. Barry Solomon, one of the partners, is handling all these major projects. And we did everything from like landscaping issues that were serious. But she walked with us in the heat and wore out shoe leather. That is critical.
Since my name's out there now. I'm Andrea Riga, by the way. One thing I do want to mention is that you asked, though, how you presented to the board. Building is an agenda item at every board meeting.
For you. I could tell you for many other organizations, it's not.
So I'm going to tell you that when we have the board meeting and we present the agenda is, almost the same every time, very similar. But it's program, it's fiscal, it's buildings always there as part of the, and there are other development and, if there were any other issues going on, building is always a major issue. So that, I'm just adding that in. So we do keep our board, we are in the process of going through some of these major innovations. They're well aware of what's going on and what the costs are and where we're getting the funding from.
So it sounds like you have a very proactive organization that spends energy and effort in understanding the needs within the building structure.
Well, I think, yeah, but I think what we try to do is, whether they want to know or not, we try and keep the board educated on what's going on, because we feel that they need to know.
That's a very important first step, because you bring to them the knowledge. How are you spending your money? Why are you spending? Here's options that we have, and give them hard data, because that's what really they're going to know is what's the bottom line. But you're able to translate that into the bottom line. Yes.
I know you have a separate question, so you got to in a minute. I just want to keep in line with the questioning that's going on right now, so we'll.
Just to expand on what Andrea and Jim were talking about, the development of a CapEx program through each organization is key. Every board needs to be proactive, understand what's coming down, what their physical property entails, and what is required in the next 3 to 5 years. More than a 5-year look ahead is basically crystal ball.
I want to comment on Barry that he's absolutely correct. At least a minimum of, say, a 3-year capital major repair, so you can understand where are we going, what kind of funds are we going to need. Not get to the board meeting and say we have to shut down part of the building because we can't have access. The roof is leaking, the pipes are broken, we don't have a boiler, we don't have heat. Let's look at it forensically, and let's project and tell them, we told you that 2 years ago. We put the ball right in your court.
Ed, you had a.
Yeah, sure. Answer to the question. So yeah, I think again this depends on the nonprofit and the board and the engagement. But obviously, the more the leadership team is engaging the board with information, the more educated they're going to be, the more they're going to feel comfortable with being involved. So I think we need to bring that perspective into it as well. Where some board members might not be comfortable enough to be actively engaged because they don't feel like their knowledge or their skill set is leads to any advantage. But having said that, I think that specifically, if we're talking about topics that might be relevant right now to a board, David mentioned the sexual harassment laws that are coming into play, and October 9th was when you had to have your policy in place. I know it was extended out to the training to 2019, but that would be one category that I think the board should be aware of. I'd love to hear David's perspective on that, but I'm sure there's some liability in there, and there is, people on your board might not be getting this training from their own employers. They might be sole proprietors, they might be employees of companies that are smaller that are not doing this type of training. So I would say that would be a very critical component of education for a board. And then look, the top expenses. And as I mentioned before, health insurance is definitely one of the key and top expenses of an organization that has employees. We have some organizations that rely on their board for their insurance advice and expertise, especially if they have people on the board that do have that type of expertise. And then other organizations that don't want to bring that up to their board because it becomes challenging. And so again, we have clients that they won't make the decision without them, and some that won't do it with them. So I think it really depends, but those are two topics that I would say specifically could be relevant to every board member.
So I'll go to big picture for a second in terms of what I find the most significant information that boards often don't get, and this leads more to the micro. But from the macro perspective, what brings people to a nonprofit board? It's the mission. Everyone's coming for the mission and the work that the organization is doing, and nobody's thinking about what in fact is the uncomfortable secret that's lurking in the shadows, and that's that, and Ed mentioned the word, liability, that under the law, directors and officers have legal duties, and they have liability when those duties are breached. And there's a very healthy process that a board undergoes when that information, when that fundamental fact gets communicated to them. Frankly, if you're on a board, you need to know and understand that. That's the least that the organization can do for you to educate you. but once you've got that perspective that the buck stops with you legally, the buck stops with you, you're responsible. Once you have that perspective, you become a lot more interested in learning more and being more educated and being more on your toes. There are all sorts of ways to approach handling these governance requirements. And the bottom line is, again, it's not rocket science. These are lots of mechanical steps and procedural requirements. And there are ways that a nonprofit can hardwire that into their operations, their board system, their board culture. And just a little plug on November 8th, I believe here at this location, Cerini and Associates is doing a board training, and I'll be presenting at that board training, and my subject matter is going to be a nonprofit governance boot camp, and basically that's going to be how we can find mechanisms to hardwire compliance into what the board does, and that really results in systematically. So you've got these legal requirements. You as a director and officer are responsible for making sure they're complied with. And so the way to handle that is to systematically deal with that compliance. And what you're doing then is at the same time, step by step, systematically taking ammunition that could be used against you off the table. And so that's kind of how it all fits together.
Just to add one comment, I serve on a board where at every meeting, the executive team says to everybody in the meeting, there are no stupid questions. And I think that really takes some pressure off some, especially new board members that are in the room, that they realize that they don't know everything about the organization, and that, you know, there really is, it's an open door policy on education and learning. So I think it sounds simple, but I think it's effective.
I was gonna say, I'm not sure that's true. I ask a lot of stupid questions.
Good morning. My name is Ben Cooper. I am a commercial lender for Bank United on Long Island. I work in the whole tri-state area. So I wanted to say, first of all, I am interested in working with nonprofits, and I'm also interested, as Ken and I have spoken about before, in becoming more involved in my community, in the community, and potentially becoming a junior or board member at multiple organizations to get more involved and have more of an influence in the community and so on.
You heard him say it. Yeah, be careful.
So for that reason, I want to say hello to all of you. So good morning. My question, I think it might be relevant to more than just me, is that although a lot of people in this room are nonprofit organizations being represented, I am in sales. I work with and foster relationships with for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And my question that I want to ask to Ken, you, and the panel is, where does my potential relationship with a board, if I were to be on one, come into play as far as the precedence for, should I then therefore rule myself out as a potential lender or a potential relationship manager of that organization? It intrigues me to know that, you know, if I was going to be getting involved, I'm not necessarily getting involved because I want to earn the relationship. I want to get involved, but knowing the policy there would be interesting to me. Thank you. You can start, David.
So I'll try to give as short an answer to that as possible. The issue that you raise is generally referred to as conflicts of interest and related party transactions, and from an IRS perspective, self-dealing. And it's a huge priority for regulators. Major initiative, probably the most significant piece of the Nonprofit Revitalization Act of 2013 was the mandating of conflict of interest policies and incredibly specific procedures to handle situations just like you're raising. So a lot of nonprofits shy away from transactions with board members. The law requires procedures to handle those. It doesn't prohibit them, but you need to kind of go in with your eyes open that that's an area of tremendous regulatory scrutiny, and just to drum it home and to kind of connect it with the liability issue. Most of my legal work is representing boards, but occasionally I get retained by an insurgent group, either a membership group or
an insurgent on a group or person on a board to challenge a board, and literally litigators in my office as we speak are putting together a lawsuit suing board members for conflicts of interest and related party transactions that were engaged in violation of the very rigorous provisions of New York state law. So main thing is to understand that there are restrictions there that you need to be aware of, and they have to be looked at very carefully and complied with meticulously, or else.
I do want to also stress that some organizations specifically prohibit conflicts, so therefore that can't happen. But just because somebody has a conflict doesn't make it a bad thing. There are board members who will provide a building on $1 lease a year. I mean, that's a very, very beneficial thing for an organization. So just because it's a conflict isn't a bad thing. As David mentioned, you just have to go through the process of vetting it out, and you have to, the process is very structured in how you go through it in terms of the individual has a conflict, can't be in the room when there's discussion taking place. The minute should reflect that that individual left the room, blah, 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 blah. So the key is really just making sure that you have all of those things in place.
To answer the question of what to put on the board agenda, my name is Sonia Sala. My company is Uplifting Nonprofits, and I've served on many boards, regional, national, and local. And answering that question, as well as the give, get, and not diversifying your income, you're relying on federal, is training the board on fundraising. You can spend 15 minutes at each board meeting telling them how to fundraise. You're expecting them to know this, and board members do not know how to ask for money. And so if you're spending at least 15 minutes at each board meeting showing them or teaching them something about fundraising, it will increase your revenue as well as expand your reach.
It's pretty funny because companies are willing to invest a whole lot of money in sales training, but you just never see a nonprofit investing money in teaching their board and teaching people how to go out and raise money. And it's the same thing. It's sales. That's what it is.
Good morning, David. My question to you is, on the board, do you have to be, as a member of a board of director with a sexual harassment, do you recommend sexual harassment training to board members that say it? Because I've heard yes and no.
Right. I think it frankly, it depends. And I think it depends on the level of interaction that the board has with staff and potentially clients of a nonprofit or people that a nonprofit serves. So it really is fact-based. And again, I mean, this is an example of the complexity of some of these rules. That's something that if a client of mine has that kind of a question, I would have my labor and employment people who deal with this every day. I would have them make the judgment call for the client. But I think that really is a fact-specific question depending on each particular organization.
Hi. As the leader of a very small, very new nonprofit, I would like to know the best way to find out about getting insurance. I have been given different amounts and different suggestions as to what is needed for us. How can I find out what is absolutely the requirement and the best way to go?
So if we're speaking about health insurance in particular,
general liability, D&O.
So do you want to speak to D&O?
So let me just kind of chime in with a quick potential answer there. First of all, you need to go back and you need to look at if you've entered into any contracts, because sometimes the contracts that you have can spell that out. You need to understand what your risk tolerance is. So if you're in a situation where, I'm a firm believer in that I'd rather get more coverage on the upside and give up a little on the downside. So if I'm in a situation where I can set a deductible of $1,000 or I can set a deductible of $5,000, and with the $1,000 deductible, I got $1 million policy, and with a $5,000 deductible, I got a $2 million policy for the same price, I'd rather get the $2 million coverage knowing I can foot a bill for $5,000 if it happens, but I can't foot a bill for $1.5 million if there's a 2.5 million, well, for $1 million if there's a $2.5 million claim, whatever. So, you know, take a look at what the coverage is, what's the low end, what's the high end, figure out what fits into your budget as an organization, figure out who could potentially sue you and what the potential exposure could be. If you're an organization that nobody ever comes to your site, maybe the exposure is less. If you're an organization that you have a lot of people coming to your site, the exposure could be greater. So you kind of have to take all of those things into effect. Same thing, if you're going to be utilizing another place, you may potentially need to get insurance as a add-on to the current policy you have. David,
so yeah, and I would amplify that with maybe just two really quick tips. One is that, and I think you're seeing that from the panel and from the moderator today, and it applies to things like insurance as well. It's really important to talk to someone who focuses on this area and who provides this kind of insurance for nonprofits. So that's number one. And the second piece is what I found just from talking to my clients is that when you ask the question, and Ken alluded to this a little bit, don't just say, give me $1 million in D&O coverage or $2 million, but when you find out how much that costs, ask the question about, well, what would it cost for $5 million? Because what I found and what insurance professionals have shared with me is that the bulk of the cost, the premium, comes from the basic coverage. And so nonprofits are very often surprised that going from $2 million to $5 million or $1 million to $3 million is incredibly inexpensive and way below what they were expecting and very cost effective. So that's just a good question to ask your insurance person.
Just one thing real quick. Turn around a second. Just turn around. You turn around. The person right behind you, he's the person, Brendan, right there. He's the person you want to ask that question to after we're over. Brendan, right there.
Yeah.
You want to ask him that question after we're done because Brendan works in insurance. So, and he's really good.
And to further that, I think what part of your question is what insurance do we need? And of course, organizations, if you start, are going to need general liability insurance for their organization. You're also going to need workers' comp if you have employees. If you do your board of directors, as David mentioned, we need directors and officers insurance. And I think one thing that we run into a lot that's often overlooked is EPLI, or employer practices liability insurance, which we find a lot is either not, organizations don't know what it is, they don't have it. And that is, I would think right now is something that's extremely in the forefront right now. The sexual harassment mandates that we're talking about. If you turn on the TV, I mean, just about every day somebody's been brought into a lawsuit at a company or a major organization. And employer practice liability is that's what it's designed to do, is help protect your organization if you're ever brought into a discrimination suit or one of your employees is brought into a discrimination suit. So I would just put particular note on that.
Question.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Michael with Spirit of Huntington Art Center. It's a not-for-profit. I think one of the things that I just wanted to bring up or talk about maybe for a second, and you had brought, maximizing your organization's potential, is maybe to discuss some of the communication issues that a lot of smaller firms might have, and especially with, marketing and putting that internal communication to the board and also the external communication. I also run an advertising agency, and I know the importance of really communicating what's happening with your organization, either through social media or through newsletters internally. But obviously that's the key to so many things, including fundraising and really getting awareness out of your mission and your vision. So not that there should be a line item, for every organization, but obviously it should be something that everyone should be talking about as the better ways of communicating today.
I want to address that lady right here. Another level with the insurance is the contractors and vendors that you hire. So what level of insurance you're going to require for them? What kind of hold harmless agreements? What kind of, if they need to provide workman's comp for you, if they have any subcontractors, understanding waivers of lien, when to get those items, and the whole protocol of doing any work with these outside vendors to make sure that you are protected. It's deep. Barry, I know you're going to comment on this.
Yeah, just two
expand on what you were just saying, there are a number of insurance companies that write insurance for contractors, but its policies will not cover person that they work for. Third-party inclusion has to be covered. A worker getting hurt on a job, whoever their employer will workers' comp, but they will come after you or the owner or the contractor for the general liability. You have to make sure your company will cover that claim.
So getting back to the communication question. When I look at communication, I'm going to throw it out to you guys too. When I look at communication, I feel that there's communication breakdown at so many levels within nonprofit organizations. Within larger nonprofit organizations, program people, fiscal people, development people, they just don't communicate effectively. It's rare that organizations bring everybody into a room and try to set up some sort of communication level. We did a project for a nonprofit a few years back where we brought the program people into a room and we just asked them how they are funded. Are you fee-based? Are you cost-based? How are you funded? Half of them got it wrong. So if they don't know the fundamentals of how they are funded, how are they making the right decisions in terms of the organization? So I think the first communication that you got to kind of build on is that internal communication, making sure that you've got the different, what I call the three key elements, fiscal, development, and program. Make sure they're all effectively communicating and that you've got a strong three-legged stool there within your organization, because if one leg is not strong enough, it's going to fall over. I think, again, comes back and we talked a little bit about communication with the board and making sure the board is aware of what's going on. We see so many times that the board is not being, information is not being effectively shared with the board of directors. So you're in a situation where things are happening within an organization and the board just doesn't know about it. And that's bad too, because the board is the one who's supposed to be making decisions and governing it. So if you're not giving the board adequate information to make decisions, how can they do it? And then the last part of the communication that you brought up is, again, messaging. How do you get your message out there? And I think some of that comes back to that whole aspect of social impact and how do you differentiate yourself from other organizations? And I think a lot of that comes into that social impact discussion, where you need to be able to show why somebody should donate to you. You need to be able to create an appropriate argument that shows that you're different from everybody else, and that if they give to you, there's going to be some sort of leverage. One of the things that Gift of Life does very effectively is Gift of Life has this whole kind of almost like the everlasting gobstopper with the different layers in there. But they have that core amount of cash, and then they have from there, they have the volunteers that build off that cash, and then they have the education of the doctors who are going out and doing surgeries and teaching other doctors, and all of a sudden that growth. So for a dollar donation to the organization, you're getting 10, 20 times return on investment. That's the messaging you got to get out there, because if you can get that messaging out there, that's what's going to make a difference in the mind of donors.
I'm going to say something real quickly. You people are the conductors of the orchestra. So when you look at communicating to someone, you point over this way, I want this person, I need this person, and you're conducting that whole orchestra of people. And if you can do that, and that becomes a strong component of your work and your life and your job, then you really foster all that communication.
I would just add, from a communication standpoint, I mean, what we see is, and going back to something that I think Sonia said before, the communication tends to be, and the marketing goes all driven towards fundraising, but I think that educating the board and educating the people within the organization on how to fundraise can be just as impactful. So I would add that to the communication theme.
Ed, one other thing, since you have the microphone in your hand, I mean, the other part of communication, you brought this up at the very beginning, is communicating with your staff. And I think that's also very, very important, because everybody's competing for the same staff. There seems to be low unemployment right now. So, again, it's how do you keep that lines of communication with your staff effective, and how do you ensure that staff members really understand, the benefits of working for your organization?
Yeah, I think that part of that is you really have to understand what it is that your staff needs and wants. And I'll add to that, understanding the needs and understanding the profile of the employees you want to attract and retain. Millennials want something different than Generation Xers, and the dreaded millennials that we hear about. But I think understanding what it is, and I've seen effective surveys of the employees when we're talking about, I mean, we see it on the employee benefit side, but talking to employees, surveying your employees on what's most important to you and your family when we provide benefits to you. What are the things you want to see in our programs and our plans? But just as effective is really understanding the profile of the employees that you want to hire and attract and retain. And as you're going out and recruiting these employees, making sure you're sending the right message from a communication standpoint to those applicants that we understand what it is you need, and we're going to provide that to you.
David, before you answer, I wanted to just throw out a question to the group based on something that Ed just said. How many of you are actually going out there and surveying your employees in terms of what they like about your organization, what they don't like about your organization, what sort of benefits are they interested in versus what sort of benefits they're getting? 5. From what Ed is saying, I mean, that sounds like a really, really important thing to be considering doing, especially if you're trying to get the next wave of leadership within your organization, which seems to be a big issue for nonprofit organizations. A lot of the leadership is getting older, and at some point in time, that leadership is going to retire, and you have to think about succession planning. So, you know, you want to make sure you've got that nice group of young leaders that are moving up the ranks, and how do you do that? But understanding and talking to them and communicating with them.
Sure, and I'll just kind of echo what we've been saying is that on a variety of levels, communication, information, and integration of the message is critical. And lots of times I've seen nonprofits sort of stumble into legal issues that they were unaware of, and I'll just kind of give you one broad example and how that may impact on communication. Very often, nonprofits create inadvertent contracts with donors based on messages around asks, and they don't realize that a statement on their website or a statement in a letter or even a verbal statement is a contract with a donor or with a large class of donors, and you're bound by that contract. It doesn't need to be a written agreement that's signed by the organization and the donor to create a contract. So that is so communication is something that, from a legal perspective, and it also ties back into what your mission is, what your corporate purposes are. One of the things that the IRS does is they look at organizations' websites. The Attorney General does that. When I get a new client, one of the first things I do is look at their website against their certificate of incorporation. And so sometimes you find great messaging by an organization, but guess what? It doesn't tie into what they're supposed to be doing. So it's important to keep your eye on the ball in that respect.
I'm Bob McGuire. I'm the Executive Director of Cerebral Palsy of Nassau County. First of all, Ken and panel, thank you very much. This is very informative, and I appreciate the opportunity. I didn't appreciate you pointing out that I was getting older, Ken.
I was actually referring to myself.
So it's an observation and a comment. We have about 5 corporations that make up our organization, and each of the boards have a different purpose. And the give-get for our foundation board is very clear. For our mother lode, not so clear. But we look at 3 W's, wealth, wisdom, and work. And that's what we measure whether or not people are making contributions on. And I think that's not something to be ignored at the exclusion of other things, but just as part of it, the prospect of measuring your board.
And you can kind of, if you do board agreements, you can kind of work that in. I still believe that every single board member should give something so that you can say that you have, full board involvement. It doesn't have to be the same amount of money for everyone. I mean, we work with I'm on a board of a nonprofit organization. I give, but we also do free work for the organization. So that's work that they would have had to pay for if we didn't provide it for them. And that's more than what their ask is of the board member. So, again, you're right.
I'd just like to say a word about communication and messaging that was brought up. And if we think about communications and messaging, if there's one thing the nonprofit community has, it's passion. They have a mission, they have a passion, the employees of the boards, members of the boards, the leadership, generally you find a tremendous amount of passion. And one of the things that can be very effective with the board and your employees, come up with a clear, consistent message of where you're going, who you serve, what are you doing, and what you're bringing to the community, and put that in front of the board. Make it easy for them to be able, when they're at the next event, wherever they are, people say, what's going on? People are impassioned. Hey, you know, I'm on the board. I'm a new member of the board of an organization. And you've already provided them the messaging, and they just repeat it. And people are interested to hear that. The biggest advocates for your organization can be your employees. If they understand that message, they want to talk about what they do. They enjoy what they do. Maybe the salary isn't good. That's a big issue. But boy, they enjoy it mostly, and they are great advocates. So I'm a big believer in write the message down, talk about the message, refine the message, and then give it to the board, give it to the leadership, give it to the employees. Everybody's on board, and people will get that out there. People will start to hear that message. So I'm a big believer in communication. I think it's a key element to the fundraising and the education. It goes a long way, and it's not hard to do. It doesn't take a lot to write it down and just get it out there.
So kind of coming back and kind of pulling some of this together, it seems to me that organizations are trying to find ways to become more effective as an organization. From your perspective, and Jim, we'll start with you. What advice would you give a nonprofit executive to help improve the overall effectiveness of their organization, especially with tightening revenue streams and everything else?
I think, you know, we spoke about today about having qualified board members, educating them, having the people that you're hiring. And again, I'm speaking from the property and facility side of it, having people who are educated. And it's difficult in our business, on my side of the business, to get people who have that education, unless you've got long experience in some of these, you know, companies. You can't go to like the ICSE, International Council of Shopping Centers, or IREM or BOMA, and get the kind of knowledge that, like myself and partner Barry Solomon, he's an architect and he's worked for the Tillis organization for many years. You know, we have empirical data, hands-on knowledge that we've gleaned through all these years and all these properties. But I think what I did as director of property management was I set out, I had 5 tenets. I want to share them with you today. And when people heard it, they started to put it up in their office, and they said, man, they said, like, wow, that is terrific. The first one was have an entrepreneurial mindset. Number 2 was to be part of the Vanguard, not the old guard. Number 3 was, again, to create value for the company.
Was that a commercial? I just heard that commercial there.
No, Ed paid me for that, but number 4 was to be an upstart, not an old fart. And number 5 was to be innovative or be gone. They knew what our direction was. And I thought that we had one of the best property, we had about 52 property managers and another probably close to 100, about 106 people as with admins who knew the mission. They knew what was expected of them. And I think as you go out, and we said before, Andrea going out wearing shoe leather, you got to touch these people, you got to speak to them. What's going on? How are you doing this? Do you have any questions of me? And once you do that, they become close to you, and I think they join the program.
So I think what we see, and from our perspective, is that organizations can sometimes be intimidated with improving things that can improve efficiencies, like outsourcing technology or outsourcing compliance or HR or things of that nature, things that have costs associated. And when we're talking about here about managing costs and tightening revenues and shrinking budgets and all of that, it's really hard for an organization to look at something that's going to cost an additional item from a perspective of what it could actually save the organization short-term and long-term. And what I mean by that is perhaps doing an analysis of the soft costs, so to speak, that might be improved within your organization. In our world, from a benefit standpoint, when we work with our clients and we're looking at benefits, we're also looking at their technology, their HR, their compliance, and how they're shifting this and or doing it internally. And so from smaller organization standpoint, you might not have a dedicated, you probably don't have a dedicated HR person that's only dedicated to HR, a compliance person that's only dedicated to compliance, or a benefit person that's only dedicated to benefits. And so it's a lot like small business, right, where you're wearing a lot of hats. And so how do you stay within that budget without and improve efficiencies and effectiveness over time? And I think a good tool to do that is to look at the soft costs, put a time value of money on each item and everything that outsourcing or improving your technology and things of that nature would alleviate. And you know, one thing I've seen in some organizations from a fundraising standpoint, they actually do that, where they'll assign employees that are working on fundraising campaigns and actually analyze what is it costing for us, and what are we really raising when we host an event, or we host a golf outing, or we have a fundraising initiative. Well, I think the same can be said of in our world from the benefit perspective of, if we outsource HR, we're going to be more compliant. We're going to be able to stay compliant with the laws that are ever changing. That could cost us less money in the long run. Short term, maybe we're doing that all that ourselves. Maybe the executive director's handling HR. Maybe or they're handling HR and development and everything, where something is bound to get missed, which would cause liability. So I think it's important to analyze that, not be intimidated of the costs associated, because quite frankly, a lot of times we work with our clients and we can recommend initiatives that really are minimal costs, but the risk associated with not doing it could be catastrophic. And David knows exactly what I'm talking about and talks about it all the time. So I think the intimidation factor, not being intimidated, looking at these things and really taking a close look at what you're spending in time would be effective.
And just following up on that, Ed, I think when you're looking at a CFO or a CEO taking on responsibilities that maybe are beneath their level, where they could be going out and fundraising or doing something much more effective with their time that's going to generate more revenue than it's going to cost in terms of outsourcing that service. So
exactly.
So from a governance perspective, something that I think is often overlooked in terms of its potential impact on effectiveness and efficiency, this is really a key apparatus in the governance toolkit, so to speak, is the use of committees. The law allows you to have a couple of different kinds of committees, board committees and then committees that are non-board committees and just of an advisory nature. And that, if you take a step back and think about it, provides a tremendous opportunity for efficiency, because it allows for a very efficient division of labor. You would put different people on a audit or finance committee than you might on an event committee. So people who are well suited in terms of their skill set for a particular area of focus can be assigned to those committees, and those committees then are delegated pieces of the board's responsibility. And that's a very technical and formal process from a governance perspective, but it allows for the committees between board meetings to be doing a tremendous amount of work. And the difference in the way a board functions when a board uses committees effectively is huge. It's day and night. And an overlooked piece of that is it's not just the people who are assigned, the board members who are assigned to the board committees, it's also the staff that supports those committees. It's really important to properly staff the committees with individuals who, again, have skill sets that are lined up with what the committee is going to do. So that's very important and creates a tremendous amount of added efficiency. And then in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, some of the things we alluded to earlier in terms of the two-way street and user-friendly meetings, user-friendly documents in advance, board education, that lends to efficiency as well. And the one note I want to make about committees, as you might expect, and I think it's a sense you get, there are lots of complexities there. So it's an essential tool that you have to use, but boards screw up committees all the time. There are all kinds of legal requirements as to who can be on a committee, what powers a committee can have, how a committee gets elected and appointed. So committees really need to be done in coordination with your lawyer, because there are all kinds of governance implications there. And in particular, the audit committee, that's the one committee that the statute actually has, a not-for-profit corporation law, has a separate section devoted only to the audit committee. It's the only committee that has that kind of section. And that committee has particular importance in terms of oversight and scrutiny. So that's something to keep your eye on as well. Seven 712 of the not-for-profit corporation law is audit committees.
Ken, was there a question? Ken, let me just ask a question to David really quick, if I could. When you refer to committees, I'm hearing you talk about the engagement between staff and those committees. Is it common practice, and this is sort of for the room as well, that sometimes when I think of this, I think of the ED and the board, and that's this thing that happens over here, but is there much engagement with the folks who are the staff and employees of the organization? Is that common practice that there is that that they do engage the staff and the and folks on the board and things, if you could?
Sure, and you know, again, it's organization specific and size and scope specific. But if you know, an organization of significant size and a board of significant size and responsibility, by definition, you're going to need that division of labor. And the ED can't be, if there are 10 different committees, the ED can't staff all of them. So very often it's the development director or the CFO or some other senior staff person that's staffing a particular committee. And that fit is very important in terms of the engagement of the board members on that committee and how effective the committee is going to be. It needs not just the right board members, but the right staff person as well. And it can't only be the ED, because the ED can't be in that many places at the same time.
Thank you.
Good morning. Just a quick question. A lot of the not-for-profits that, in my world, which is youth services, are small not-for-profits. They don't have a large board. My question is, how do they ensure that they are identifying suitable candidates to ensure that they are running a healthy organization? And in addition to that, what's a healthy number for a small non-for-profit, a healthy number of board members on the board? We have non-for-profits that sometimes have 2 board members, and it's difficult to do the work with such a small number, I find.
Yeah, I'll start off. I would say it depends. And so I am the president of the Bayside Business Association, and we're a small nonprofit, 501c6, and we have 14 board members. We have no staff. It's a trade organization for the local, to give back to the local businesses, and we have no staff. We have 14 board members. And I would say that every one of those board members has tremendous value, and we are still every day working towards getting the most out of every board member to help the organization, because in our situation, it's a volunteer army, so there is no staff. In small and non-profits, it's really not much different if you have a really small 1 or 2 person staff. In that case, as I have mentioned before, the organization, the executive directors, the leadership team are probably doing all the work, and they're doing everybody's job to some degree. So I would say, as far as the number, and I'd love to hear David and Jim's opinion on this, but as far as the number of board members, I think it's more about evaluating the quality of the board members and the people that really, you could have 20 board members, but if 20 board members are, 15 of them are never showing up for meetings and don't get and don't understand what your mission is, that's not going to really help you. If you had 5 that were fantastic board members, you could probably do the same amount of work.
So one thing in particular that I want to react to, you mentioned that you were aware of a board that had two members. So the one thing that we can say that's hardwired in the statute, if it's a New York not-for-profit formed under New York law, there has to be a minimum of 3 directors. So that's absolutely required. And Beyond that, as Ed said, it really depends on the organization. I've had clients that had 50 people on the board. Those are very interesting conference calls. You know, national nonprofit with 20 people on the phone and 20 people in the room. Those were interesting meetings. So sometimes the size of, there's an inclination add, and it is important to kind of think about efficiency and culture. Sometimes a board can get too big. But the one thing that we know for sure is that if it's a New York nonprofit, you can't have less than 3. And then the sky's the limit, but the sky may not be so advisable in terms of what a manageable and effective number is.
Jim, did you have a response?
I just look at it from kind of a simplistic view, and that is I've either dealt with boards who try to do this to me, or I'm coming to them with a lot of information. We spoke about having knowledgeable people, or I'm doing this to them. Because I don't let them, my whole approach to them is to come in with the information and the data, so that when you start asking me a question, I've already answered most of those questions. If you want to find some little small question here, that's great. But again, I think if you're with these boards, if you've got knowledgeable people and you don't let them, if you're coming in with data, that's great. They can't do this to you. Otherwise, what they'll do is, well, why are we doing this? How come you're using this type of equipment? When are we doing this? You should have those answers. And once you do that and you show them that you come prepared to these meetings, you're going to have some people, as we spoke about, who may not have that knowledge and may say, you know what, I might be a little intimidated, or this isn't for me. Be forward, be informed, and give them the information that they need.
I want to ask a question to the group. How many of you, before you hire an employee, interview the employee? I'm assuming all of you, right? Okay, good. How many of you, before you hire a board member, spend the same level of effort interviewing the board member? Just a few of you. Why is a board member any different from an employee of the organization? Why is a board member less important? I would say a board member is more important. We should do more due diligence on a board member. We should spend more time talking to a board member. Yet I find that organizations spend a lot more time talking to their staff and making sure they got the right staff person in place than they spend talking to their board members and making sure they got the right board members in place. So I think, when you look at how do you get effective board members, you have to work at it. You have to put the pieces in place. They have to know what's expected of them. They need to have that, go through that interview process. You got a date. Go through the interview process and find out if they're the right person that you want to marry to your organization. And too many organizations, someone says, oh, I know Jim over here, and Jim's a great guy, and everybody says, well, if he says he's a great guy, okay, he's on the board. Nice. It's not the way it should be. There's a question back here first.
Hi, my name is Glenn Stannis. I'm with the AC. I'd just like to get back to training for a second. With the level of dollars coming from taxpayers and major donors and funneling down through funders to not-for-profits, I just find it amazing that board and senior staff training of CEO, CFO is not mandatory. Like, why would this not be mandatory?
Because organizations, and I apologize, I know there's a room full of nonprofit organizations, but nonprofit organizations, their focus and their mindset is program. Administration. That's not the way it should work. I mean, again, it all is important to an organization. You got to think about all of those, but we are so geared in the nonprofit sector that we run lean. We're proud. We spent 3% on administration. Wow. Where's the infrastructure? Where's the stuff you need to do? We're proud of the fact that we don't spend money, and that's not the way it should be. Sorry.
Was part of, before we leave that question, I don't know if maybe part of where you're coming from is why isn't it mandatory from a legal perspective? And if that's your question, if it's not, I think it still would be a good question. And the legislature hasn't gotten to that yet. They may at some point, and frankly, it makes perfect sense. But remember, whether the board and the officers are educated or not, they've still got the liability. So from the legislature's perspective, they're covered. I don't think that's a really fair deal from a board member perspective, as you might have gathered so far. And the other thing that I want to say, because a couple of people have mentioned that they were from small nonprofits, and this is another unfortunate reality of the regulatory environment that we live in. By and large, the same governance rules and requirements apply to small nonprofits as apply to mega nonprofits. And that is, if you're a startup nonprofit, tell me how you can possibly comply with this level of legal, where are the resources, right, to do this sort of ongoing, diligent, careful legal work and accounting work and at every turn. So it really is almost an impossible situation. But and we've raised that. The State Bar Association has raised that with the legislature, and to no avail. The regulators basically, the Attorney General's office, they're not interested in carving anybody out. Everybody's got to meet these requirements, and there's no flexibility. So that, I think, frankly, is an impossible situation for small nonprofits. But that's what we're stuck with.
I guess what prompted the question was, I guarantee if everybody went around and polled their board members, a lot of them just aren't aware of their fiduciary responsibility. I mean, or at least the level of it. They just would have no concept that, they're that far in. So.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions. So it's down here, it's Andrea, it's up there. Yeah. Go by order of the hands that went up.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Rembrandt. I'm the executive director of the Community Synagogue in Port Washington. So we're a membership-based organization primarily, serving our members. But I want to go back really quickly. You mentioned the board interview. And I'm relatively new at this organization. This is the first time that the board nominating committee didn't include me as the executive on the interview process. In fact, I got new board members who I did not even know their names until the annual meeting when we announced them, and have never met them before. So just maybe someone ask some guidance on, is it, I imagine it's probably legal that the board can pick their own members, but is there some trick to getting them to, maybe include me in some more of these conversations?
Pretend to be a board member.
I was going to say congratulations.
One second.
My cynical side would say good luck, but my experience was I've experienced the same thing, and with the board president and senior members of the board came to an agreement that I should be a part of the process, and leaving me out of that would be to not fully be able to vet what we need and how we're going to work going forward. So I think you need to get to your senior members and convince them that they're missing out on value by leaving you out.
Wait, we just skipped two people. Okay.
To the same point.
I thought he was done with his questions.
I know. Thank you for allowing me one more. There's no person in a nonprofit organization that knows the organization better than the CEO, better than the board members and better than anyone else. And to not have that person at those recruitment meetings to provide information is just negligence. So it's a best practice to always have the CEO be part of the recruitment process.
Our corporate bylaws that they just changed, our board president is our CEO, and I'm the executive director. So they think they have the CEO there.
Well, this is for our attorneys here. Separating the board president and the CEO is essential.
Yeah, and you can write bylaws. So really important point is that there's some things in the law where you don't have flexibility and you can't change them in the bylaws. But this kind of thing, you could write the bylaws either way. But I certainly concur with the unanimous sentiment here. Even though it's still legal to exclude you in that way and have that in the bylaws, it makes no sense. It's completely impractical and certainly not a best practice, as you indicated. So.
Have your board call David. Blame it on him.
So I think I'm going backwards again, but just to board training. You know, annually we do the compliance training. We're pretty open at the board meetings about different issues that are going on, but you brought up the sexual harassment policy and other policies that we may have in the school. Should we be actually making them familiar with the personnel manual that includes a lot of these policies and other policies that we have? Is that something board members should be familiar with, or just be knowledgeable that we have all the policies in place? I mean, they sign the conflict of interest, the whistleblower. We do that on an annual basis when the compliance officer trains them. But are you suggesting that they should be familiar with the other policies within the agency?
I think it varies. I think the sexual harassment policy, that may be something because of some of the specific requirements and some of the scrutiny and the high profile and the high stakes. That would be something that I would make sure the board is aware of and sees and understands. So, you know, I think it's really, the board's not going to delve into the entire employee manual, but there are pieces of it that I think they need to be educated about.
Remember, the board sets
Thank you.
overarching policy. And
Right.
then, you know, it's up to the organization then to kind of fill in the pieces.
Well, that's
so,
what
yeah.
we do, but that's
Yeah.
you know, just because it came up before. And I just want to respond to something that you said about, you know, the not-for-profits being program, and to a certain extent, yes. But and I know that, you know, even on my end, I always are, you know, crazy looking at those administrative percentages because of also the way we're funded.
Yeah.
And also that's not where you want the money to necessarily go to. But the reality of it, I think for most nonprofits now, at least I experience it and where we are, is that you are not necessarily just, unfortunately, not just focused on program anymore, because the regulations you are overwhelming, as you know, especially if you're under the you have more than regulatory body. Forgetting the New York State and federal government, but all the other funding agencies. So I think the focus is, unfortunately, not so much on program anymore.
It's on compliance,
but more on compliance and regulations. I think that's where it's going. The problem is that we just can't expend the funds so much on the administrative end of those compliance, of maintaining that. But
I agree.
that's it.
Question.
Hi, this young lady addressed it a little earlier, but I know the comment came up earlier about board members, and there's not a requirement for board members to have training. I guess it depends upon the industry. I work at DDI, an agency that receives Medicaid funding, and obviously there is a requirement if you receive a certain Medicaid funding to have corporate compliance training for the board on an annual basis.
Any other questions before I move on? Okay, we're running low on time, so I kind of want to throw out one last question here. Organizations have to balance cost and mitigation of risk on a regular basis. So things like, do we buy cyber insurance? Do we move our systems to the cloud? Each of you guys have helped your clients in a different field to deal with risk. So what would you advise your nonprofits, the nonprofits here, in terms of what they can do in each of your respective areas? And since Ed, you have the microphone, you can start. From a risk perspective, what can they do to mitigate risk?
Yeah, so I'll go back to something I said before. I think that analyzing these areas, especially compliance, is a huge benefit for the future in mitigating risk and cost. One thing I would just throw out a few from in the employee benefit side for the Affordable Care Act. And I think there's a thought process now that's kind of gone by the wayside a bit, and because it's not, you know, every day on the news anymore. But in fact, it's really not. It is a huge concern for organizations. You know, from providing health insurance coverage to your employees, that would only apply to organizations that have 50 full-time equivalents or more. But on the other side, there's a series of notices and required notices, like some of you might be aware of the Medicare Part D notice that's required to be distributed to your employees by October 15th. There's a lot of things that are tied to the Affordable Care Act that still impact organizations of all sizes. And in fact, on that thought pattern of it's still on the forefront, just last year, the 226J letters went out informing employers of penalty exposure from 2015. So that just happened this time last year, which was the first year that employers had to comply with the Affordable Care Act as far as offering coverage. I think that's something that's still in the forefront that will rear its ugly head in the near future. Granted, most nonprofits don't have to worry about that. From our perspective, nonprofits' benefits and their contribution definitely meet minimum value, and they're definitely affordable in most case scenarios. But those other type of things that the Affordable Care Act imposes, such as the notifications and things like that, are things that we see often that, especially in the smaller nonprofits, are not being done. ERISA is another one. ERISA is something that requires 5,500 filing, again, if you're over 100 participants. But on a smaller level, for every nonprofit, you must have a summary plan description for all of your employee benefit plans. And one thing that we find out is when we're out there and we're talking to smaller type organizations especially, is that they don't even know what a summary plan description is. But it's written in the law under the Affordable Care Act, and it's not a summary benefit coverage. It's not a highlight sheet that explains what their copays are and deductibles. It's a summary plan description. And typically, it's a very inexpensive thing to create, and it can really mitigate a lot of risk by just that one document in highlighting your benefit plans to your employees, making them understand exactly what they have offered to them, and as well as providing them with the required notices that the Affordable Care Act and ERISA are required, like that Medicare Part D notice. So I would say from a risk mitigation standpoint, that is something that is in the forefront that everybody should be concerned with. One other thing I'll throw out that we see every day is Section 125 cafeteria plans. And any organization that is doing pre-tax deductions from their employees must have a Section 125 plan in place. And I think one thing that we see is that a lot of organizations will think because you notified your payroll company that you're making a pre-tax deduction that you've done everything you're supposed to do. In fact, you need to have a Section 125 adoption agreement in order to make those pre-tax deductions. And we find that most organizations don't know if they have it or don't have it at all. And so there is something that's not often audited. So it's not something that's in the forefront. However, there are costly fines that could be associated with something like that. And, those are the kind of things that we're talking to our clients and organizations about as far as mitigating risk. And, just on that thought pattern that we talked about before, as far as attracting and retaining employees, outsourcing this kind of stuff to things like PEOs or private exchanges can create that model and help with compliance. It can help with HR, and it can help with technology. That all goes hand in hand and will help especially smaller type organizations, mitigate a lot of these risks. These are the kind of things that we're helping and talking to our clients about.
Let's go with Jim next.
I think it's really, you're looking at trying to, if you're an owner of a building, you've obviously got to hire good people. We know that. But whether it's associates or whether it's outside vendors or advisory people, you need to get a various slice of information from people. And the other thing, I'm going to jump into this immediately, is zero-based budgeting. Now, I just heard something the other week, and I said, I need to bring this up to this group. And that's Neil Armstrong's stuff that he had from the moon and everything was recently put up for auction. How does that relate to us? When you think about what it took to get these men to the moon and back, it took very rigorous and extensive analyzation of every piece of material, everything that they did in order to get these people back safely. Let's look at your organizations. Looking at zero-based budgeting makes you look at each line item. Lets you go through your organization. Is everything firing on all cylinders? And that's why I keep pounding that mantra, saying, get out there, walk with your people, speak with these people. If you've got some tenets that you can give, tenets being, a discipline or doctrine held by a group, you get that out to them. I said to you before, always have an entrepreneurial mindset and everything. So those things, as you go through that rigorous testing of your budgets, you're going to find things. And you're going to be able to go to your board and say, you know, we need to get rid of the air conditioning system. We're spending so much money, or we need to get a plan to do the roofing, or the paving, or the striping, or our ADA is not compliant. So as you do that rigorous testing, that's going to be important for you. Bidding out your contracted services, but you have to know what to specify. So the more you touch upon those people who are experts in their field, the better off all of you will be in order to get the right price and the right scope of work. If you lease a space within the building, make sure you understand the lease and your rights. Calling a property manager because you have a roof leak is not the right way to go. Oftentimes, what you may need to do is send a certified letter. If that's in the lease, send a certified letter, return receipt request, and say, hey, I've called 4 times, I'm not getting an answer. Maybe you have a self-help clause in your lease, and David may want to expand upon that later, I don't know, but that gets a landlord's attention just like that. 5 calls to a property manager, goes right to the garbage. Not all the time, sometimes. Know your rights and the services that should be provided for you, again, if you're leasing space. And if you own the building, if you're leasing the building, whatever, you've got to understand, you know, what are you responsible for? Speak to people who can give you the right information. Just getting something from your facility manager saying, oh, we've got this handled, you need to be careful of that. Get the right information.
One thing I just wanted to add to my comments from before is part 2 of that question was how do you go about identifying these challenging areas? And I think one thing that we do that might be useful for you is to schedule compliance reviews with your partners outside of just the open enrollment period for your benefits. Right? Open enrollment can be a little stressful as far as plans renewing and communicating to employees, but what we like to do is schedule 6-month reviews with our clients. And something that you can do is talk to your partners about doing compliance reviews so that they can offer solutions and strategy to help you comply with a lot of these things that apply to your organization.
Thanks. So from my perspective, mitigation of risk is pretty straightforward. We mitigate risk on the governance side by systematically addressing governance and compliance requirements and obligations. And by doing that, we're taking one by one, we're taking them off the table as ammunition that can be used against officers and directors. And so that's going to take time. It's going to take focus, commitment, discipline. It's not rocket science, but you're going to have to apply your focus and attention to it. Something a little less obvious that I think contributes, at least in my experience, to mitigation of risk is being able to attract and keep high caliber board members. And that kind of ties into a lot of the things that all of us have been saying, including all of you sitting here, in terms of the two-way street that Ken mentioned earlier. And when you have qualified, desirable, high caliber board members, that's going to help you mitigate risk because you're going to have a more effective board that can comply with its oversight responsibilities in a more effective way. And so all the things that we talked about in terms of board education, board members feeling that they're resourced appropriately, that they're protected appropriately, that their time and their efforts are respected, all of that ties into, in my mind, attracting and keeping the board members you want, and in the process, mitigating risk.
Any other questions? One of the ways that we kind of try to mitigate risk is by doing things like this, educating the nonprofit sector. So, we try to bring to the sector, all of us, information so that you guys are more informed to move forward. So we do really like your feedback. So if you guys can provide feedback in terms of what other topics you'd like to hear about, what are the things you want us to talk about in the future, that's really important to us because we feel that a big chunk of our job, all of us feel this way, is that we're here to educate the sector. And if we're going to play in this sector, we have to kind of give back to the sector too. So that's what this is all about. So we thank everybody for coming. Hope that you got something out of today. And again, provide whatever feedback you can. We appreciate it. Thanks.